Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon or good evening. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to be back speaking at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, particularly to be in this beautiful, for me, new building and new lecture hall. I want to offer a special word of thanks to Chano-san and Murata-san for their hospitality and their support. My topic today is the challenge to the liberal international order posed by the increasingly assertive revisionist authoritarian powers, China and Russia. I would like to begin by discussing what I mean by the term liberal international order and briefly examining the role that this idea has played in the evolution of American grand strategy. Then I want to discuss the emergence of the authoritarian challenge, the factors that are driving the behavior of Russia and China, and the strategies that they're pursuing, and I will conclude with some thoughts about the implications for our strategies, the liberal democracies, and especially the United States and Japan. If I could just have the next slide, please. This is an outline of my remarks. As envisioned by the early theorists of liberalism, a liberal international order would be a system of states built on liberal principles, and in particular, on the belief in the importance of individual freedom and in the inherent and equal worth of every person. The idea that human freedom is a universal value, as we would say today. This belief in the sanctity of the individual gives rise to certain political rights, freedom of speech and religion, equal treatment under law, and so on. And perhaps the most famous and certainly the most succinct expression of these arguments is contained in the American Declaration of Independence, which says in its opening paragraphs, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Such claims lead to a preference for institutions that are designed to protect and promote those rights, and are the institutions of liberal democracy, representative government, laws, independent courts, private property, reliance on market forces, and so on. And this, in turn, gives rise to a vision of the ideal international order, a system made up of liberal democratic states, at peace, trading with one another, and linked together by certain rules and international institutions. And this is essentially the vision that was laid out by the philosopher Immanuel Kant in his 1795 essay, Perpetual Peace. And this vision is implicit in the principles on which the American Republic was founded. It was advocated as a goal of American policy from the start by some, Thomas Jefferson being one, although not others, Alexander Hamilton, for example, who rejected this idea as a fantasy. But as a practical matter, the United States did little actively to help spread democracy and build a liberal international order for roughly the first 100 years of the nation's history. It was simply too weak initially, and then too much preoccupied with its own development. It's only after the turn of the 20th century that this vision begins to reemerge and to become a guide to practical policy. Ultimately, although its initial efforts were not successful, the United States would try 3 times over the course of the century to create a liberal international order. In the wake of World War I, Woodrow Wilson tried and failed to impose his vision of free trade, national self-determination, and collective security on a resistant world and a skeptical U.S. Congress. After World War II, once it had become clear that a global liberal order was impossible, the United States, its allies, and its former adversaries set out to build a partial one. And this ultimately grew to encompass North America, Western Europe, and parts of East Asia, referred to broadly, although not geographically correctly, as the West. mostly liberal democracies, linked together by increasing flows of goods and capital, and by a network of institutions, military institutions, alliances, economic institutions like the OECD, the IMF, and political institutions like the Group of Seven. At the end of the Cold War, American and other Western leaders sought to expand the boundaries of the Western liberal order by making it finally truly global, incorporating the former communist countries, bringing them more fully into the Western-built international economy, a process that had already been begun a decade or so before with China, and to the extent feasible, into other multilateral institutions. There was only one problem. At least initially, most of these countries didn't meet what had previously been assumed to be the basic requirement for full membership in a liberal international order. They were not themselves liberal democracies. In the case of the smaller, weaker, former communist states in Eastern Europe, the West imposed requirements to meet certain standards of economic and political reform before their incorporation. But the West lacked sufficient leverage to compel change in either Russia or China. And the hope in the early 1990s was that incorporating them as fully as possible into the liberal international order would accelerate their inevitable transformation into liberal democracies. And it's the failure of this attempt at inclusion and incorporation, sincere and well-intentioned, although it undoubtedly was, that lies at the heart of the current crisis. Thanks in large part to their enhanced access to the economies and societies of the West, Russia, and to an even greater extent China, have gotten richer and stronger. But as has become quite clear in recent years, they have not liberalized domestically, nor have they become satisfied status quo powers internationally. To the contrary, over the course of the past decade, both have become more repressive, more aggressive, and more open in challenging key aspects of the existing order. How did this happen? What went wrong? In the case of China, it seems clear in retrospect that from the start, the beginning of the process of reform and opening up, and especially after the Tiananmen Square incident of 1989, the CCP regime never intended to permit political liberalization and remained also wary of full liberalization of the economy. After Tiananmen in the early 90s, the regime made the decision to continue with the process of reform and opening up, which of course fueled China's dramatic economic growth, but it also made the decision to maintain tight political control. Liberals or advocates of political liberalization were purged from the leadership, and the Chinese party state adapted and developed tools for retaining state control, including the use of so-called patriotic education to instill nationalism and mobilize popular support, as well as improved techniques for controlling information and monitoring the population. And the China we see today is the direct lineal descendant of the China that began to emerge in the early 1990s. It's not the China that we hoped for and that many people expected. The Russian case is in some ways more complicated, and Russia's path is less direct. After the Cold War, Russia's leaders, I think, genuinely sought initially to join the West, to liberalize politically as well as economically. But attempts at reform went badly astray, almost from the start. Privatization via so-called shock therapy contributed to economic collapse and poor performance that dragged on for a decade, and this weakened the hands of reformers and strengthened extreme nationalists and former communists. And this process also led to extreme concentrations of wealth in the hands of a few so-called oligarchs. And this contributed to the corruption of Russia's political process. Even before the emergence of Vladimir Putin as Russia's leader at the end of the century, the country's nascent democratic institutions were already badly weakened. And of course, as we now know, Putin proceeded to crush opposition and to concentrate all power in his own hands. Russia and China differ considerably in terms of their material power and their prospects for the future, and the Russian and Chinese regimes differ in many details, but they share certain essential features. Politically, both are authoritarian systems in which decision-making power is concentrated in the hands of a small ruling elite, unchecked by free elections, autonomous legislatures, or independent judiciaries. Neither provides protections for civil liberties or basic human rights. Both impose strict controls on speech, the press, political opposition, civil society, and non-governmental organizations. To justify their harsh rule, both deploy nationalist ideologies that emphasize the need for military strength and eternal vigilance against foreign aggression and domestic subversion. And, as we saw clearly at last week's 19th Party Congress, both are now ruled by visible, vigorous, and evidently popular maximum leaders of the sort historically associated with with fascism. Economically, both deploy a form of state capitalism, a mix of private and public ownership and control of the means of production, albeit one in which the dividing line between the two spheres is often blurred beyond recognition. And in part as a result of that blurring, both have experienced extremely high levels of corruption. In both, the state still formulates plans and supports national champions and seeks to steer the overall direction of the economy, even though there is heavy reliance on market mechanisms to determine the distribution of resources. And both are deeply integrated into the global economy with substantial inward and outward flows of goods, services, and capital. In addition to their similar internal characteristics, both regimes are driven in their external behavior by a similar mix of considerations and sentiments, and I would highlight three. The first is resentment. Resentment at perceived past humiliations and injustices. And these sentiments, I think, are genuine. There's no denying that this is the way the leaders of both countries feel, but they're also manipulated by the regimes in both countries for purposes of generating and gaining public support. In Russia, the resentments are relatively recent. The indignities associated with the collapse of Soviet power and the fragmentation of the Soviet Union, what Russians often perceive as Western condescension and moralizing and lecturing, and what they believe is an attempt on the part of the West to deny Russia's status as a great power. In China, these feelings of resentment have more distant roots. The so-called century of humiliation that begins with the Opium Wars against Britain and ends with the coming to power of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. But the resentment is also fed by more recent developments, the attempted isolation of China by the United States during the first 20 years following the founding of the People's Republic, the imposition of sanctions on China after Tiananmen, the persistent presence of U.S. military forces and U.S.-led alliances along its maritime periphery. So in both cases, there is resentment at the existing order and questioning of the moral foundations of that order. The second sentiment that I think drives a lot of the behavior of both Russia and China is ambition. Both seek to establish or to reestablish themselves as major global powers, and they want the prestige that comes with that status and with the recognition of that status by others. And again, the timelines are slightly different. Russia's ambitions reach back really only a quarter century to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which Vladimir Putin famously described as the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. China's ambitions are longer, of more distant origin, dating back 150 years and more. Both Russia and China, in addition to this desire for status and recognition as great powers, also have more tangible and concrete goals and ambitions. And in particular, I think both seek to establish a regional sphere of influence in which they are clearly the preponderant power. For Russia, that sphere of influence appears to extend to the borders of the former Soviet Union. There's a sense that the breaking away of the Baltic states, of Ukraine, Georgia, and so on, was an undesirable result of the end of the Cold War, and that this is naturally a domain in which, if not actual direct control, Russia should have a dominant influence. China, I think, seeks preponderance in a wider zone, Eastern Eurasia, including both maritime East Asia and the continental periphery to China's west. And I believe, and has become, I think, increasingly evident, although not fully, China also has broader global ambitions. Although these are not fully formed and fully articulated, nevertheless, it's my view that China's leaders now aspire to achieve parity with the United States, having for many years denied that they were in any sense equal to the United States or were not a great power. I think now they clearly see themselves, along with the U.S., as standing head and shoulders above all other powers in the international system. And if you read the writing of at least some Chinese commentators, you begin to see the possibility of an ambition eventually to displace the United States as the dominant power in the international system. So, ambition as well as resentment. The final driver of both Russian and Chinese behavior is insecurity. Notwithstanding their recent resurgence, both feel threatened from outside and from within. Again, as with these other sentiments, I think there's no reason to doubt the sincerity of these perceptions on the part of the leaders of Russia and China. But it's also clear in both cases that the elites, the leaders, use supposed threats to justify internal repression and external aggression. Both believe that the West, with the United States in the lead, seeks to contain or encircle them. And both also see the West as attempting to subvert and destabilize their domestic political systems in order to weaken them and to compel them to adopt the Western model of liberal democracy, which both now quite clearly and explicitly reject. Turn now to the question of the strategies that the two powers have adopted to achieve their ends. I think to counter what they see as these threats of encirclement and subversion, both Russia and China had devised broadly similar strategies that combine 5 major elements. First is a continuation and exploitation, to the extent possible, of the economic openness of the West. That openness, as I've said, is critical, has been critical in promoting economic growth, and both in Russia and especially in China. There's a desire to maintain that growth, and there's a recognition that, at least for the time being, access to the markets of the West and to the capital and technology of the West are critical for achieving that end. But in addition, this economic openness also creates opportunities to exert leverage and to influence Western policy. Lobbies or interest groups favoring continued economic engagement with both powers, regardless of their behavior, have grown up in most of the major Western countries, including the United States. So as a result of this economic exchange and trade, In addition to prosperity, both Russia and China have gained a degree of political leverage which they use for strategic purposes. So they would like to continue to exploit the openness of the West, and that's the first element in their strategy. Secondly, both seek to weaken and divide the West. China has sought in particular to prevent, or at least to delay, effective counterbalancing in response to its growing power. And it's done this through the use of economic inducements and the threat that the profits and benefits of economic exchange with China would be lost if Western countries were too vigorous in seeking to balance its growing power. Both Russia and China have also engaged in what Chinese refer to as political warfare or influence operations that are aimed at shaping elite perceptions. In the case of China, I think these influence operations are meant to convey the message that although China's intentions are benign, its rise is also inevitable and unstoppable. Russia has used its own form of political warfare to divide the Western alliance, or to try to divide the Western alliance, and to destabilize key countries. Propaganda, disinformation conveyed via both traditional methods and modern social media, support for populist candidates who are seen in many cases to favor policies of isolation or are opposed to existing alliances that Russia also opposes, political parties, and separatist movements. And they have made efforts to sway or disrupt democratic elections, including, as we now know, in the United States. The third element in the strategy of both countries is an attempt to harden their own societies against what they see as this Western threat of subversion. And they've done this, I think, by trying to implement what one might think of as a layered defense. First, control flows of information, including via the internet, which of course we realize in retrospect was seen incorrectly in the 1990s as something that would inevitably corrode the power of authoritarian regimes. President Bill Clinton famously said at one point in the 1990s that trying to control the internet was like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. And of course, that's impossible. But it turns out that controlling the internet is not impossible if you're willing to pay the price. And China is far ahead in this regard, but Russia is now trying to catch up with China's help. As recently as last year, Russian authorities announced that they would be cooperating with China to assert greater control over the internet in Russia, and they referred to the Russians as the world's leading authorities on the control of the internet, which is correct. Both have also sought to refine their techniques of repression, and again, I think in this regard, China leads the way. Widespread use of facial recognition software to monitor movements of people, the use of so-called big data to build what's referred to in Orwellian term as a social credit system in which virtually every transaction in which a person is involved is recorded and monitored and checked for indications of political unreliability is something which apparently is going to be put into place in the next several years. So that's the second layer. And finally, the last layer of defense against subversion is the development of nationalist, illiberal, anti-Western ideologies in both cases. And I think these are meant to inoculate the Russian and Chinese populations against the appeal of supposedly universal values by, among other things, dismissing them as chauvinist, as corrupt, decadent, and so on. And both in Russia and in China, the political and social and economic problems that many Western countries, including the United States, have experienced in recent years are useful to the regime in feeding a narrative about the flaws and weaknesses of the West and the inapplicability of the Western model. And in both cases, the regimes of these countries have emphasized, instead of the idea of universal values, supposedly unique, distinctive, and superior Russian or Chinese values. And those happen, among other things, to stress the importance of a strong state and of the collective over the individual. The fourth element in the strategy of both countries is an attempt ongoing to alter the territorial status quo along their peripheries by adopting a policy of what one might think of as modulated or controlled aggression towards the West. In both cases, both Russia and China have invested considerable resources in building up all of the implements of military power, both nuclear weapons and conventional weapons, for the purpose of deterring Western intervention along their frontiers. Both have also sought to improve their ability to use force and to use threats without provoking a major Western response. And in the Russian case, this involves the development of so-called new generation warfare or hybrid warfare, the famous little green men who showed up in Crimea, people wearing unmarked uniforms of uncertain origin who were probably in most cases Russian special forces troops, but who could operate deniably in ways that achieve Moscow's objectives but put some distance between the Russian authorities and themselves. And the Chinese, too, have developed their own forms of hybrid warfare. They talk about the three warfares, lawfare, information warfare, and so on. They've also developed and sought to use a maritime marine force and even nominally civilian fishing fleets in order to achieve their objectives in the South China Sea, the process of island construction, again, intended to change the status quo to advance China's goals without reaching a level of aggression that would provoke a strong Western response. And both Russia and China, through the use of these techniques, are trying to push outward around their periphery, to create facts, to change the situation on the ground, and to establish zones of effective control. Fifth and finally, both Russia and China, I think China in a more perhaps deliberate and long-term way, want to continue to exploit and selectively weaken existing international rules, norms, and institutions while beginning to put in place the pieces of an authoritarian or an alternative authoritarian Eurasian regional order. So they're not seeking to overthrow the current international system in all of its aspects. That's true. They benefit from many of them. They're also trying to weaken and undermine some of them. But I think what they're trying to do is to build in their own neighborhood an alternative system that they think will help secure their illiberal regimes. And this alternative Eurasian regional order would be made up of authoritarian regimes that would be linked together by trade, by transport and communications infrastructure, including portions of an internet or an intranet that would be insulated largely from the outside world, and by some multilateral institutions. And this authoritarian regional order in Eurasia would be nested or embedded within a weakened liberal international system that would remain in place at least for a time. And this alternative system, ideally, would have semi-permeable boundaries. The authoritarian powers would like to be able to continue to export goods and export capital and to reach into and manipulate the open societies and political systems of the West. They don't seek to cut themselves off completely from the West. They want to continue to benefit from economic engagement. They want also to continue to import resources and import raw materials and technology as needed to fuel their own economic development. But their intent, I think, on strictly controlling the inward flow of competitive goods and even more of dangerous ideas and information. The challenge posed by Russia and China is, in my view, deeply rooted in the character of their domestic political regimes. They need friction. They need confrontation to a point with outside forces, with the West, in order to rally support and bolster their legitimacy. And they believe themselves to be threatened by the liberal democratic states and the international order that those states have built. So we in the West, in the liberal democracies, may not think that we're engaged in an ideological struggle with these regimes, but I think they believe that they are in one with us. And I would say also that, in my view, the authoritarian regimes fear the democracies not so much for what they do as for what they are and what they represent. In part for this reason, the prospects for splitting Russia and China are, in my view, not good, at least in the short run. Russia and China may not, in the long run, be natural allies. I think, in fact, they probably are not. But at least for the moment, they're joined together by some important convergent interests, economic interests in particular, but also they're joined together by a shared animosity towards the West that's unlikely to abate as long as the current regimes remain in power. Under these circumstances, the liberal democracies, in my view, have no choice but to heighten their vigilance and strengthen their defenses. Even as they continue to engage with Russia and China and to seek cooperation with them wherever that's possible, the democratic countries need to enhance their military capabilities and improve coordination among themselves so as to deter aggressions and attempts at coercion and keep the peace. And I would say, although this is not a trivial or easy thing to do, we know how to do this. What may be lacking at the moment are sufficient resources and also the political will necessary to generate those resources. At the same time as they defend the external peripheries of their system, the democracies also need to do more to protect their open economies and their political systems against attempts at exploitation and manipulation by the authoritarian challengers. And this will be difficult for a variety of reasons, but it's by no means impossible. We need, I think, to begin by acknowledging the nature and the seriousness of the danger we face, and then to begin working together to meet it. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
笹川平和財団の渡辺恒夫と申します。よろしくお願いします。先ほど茶野さんから3回目の登壇ということで、ありますが、多分3回目全部実は関係していて、つまり1回目というのは実はクローズだったんですけども、 NATO という事務総長というそのヨーロッパの同盟のリーダーと実はクローズでちょっと日本の専門家との話をさせてもらって、で2回目っていうのはサイバーセキュリティだったんですけど、もちろんサイバー攻撃をしている主体は今フリードバーグ先生が話した中国やロシアや特に非民主的な国がかなり、もちろん民主国家がサイバー攻撃しないわけじゃないんですが、どちらかというとオープンなシステムがに利益を持っているところは、そういうことはむしろ自分たちにマイナスになりますから、かなりあまり極端な形ではしないわけですよね。そこで今日のフリードバーグ先生のお話だったんで、大変私自身も考えることが普通考えるよりもさらに多く考えさせられました。それで質問皆さんからお受けする前に、私自身もせっかくですからいろいろちょっと質問をさせていただくという、そういう大変ありがたい機会をもらいました。まず最初にですね、お聞きしたいことがあります。それは何かというと、私も非常に賛同するところが多いんですが、アメリカの在り方、つまり価値ですね、バリュー、 こういうことが実はすごく重要であって、そしてアメリカとの同盟国、日本もそうですし、欧州の同盟国もこのバリューのもとに今までの安定した秩序と、それからそれに乗る形でやはり豊かな社会を構築してきたと、これは間違いないと思います。で、ロシアや中国ですら一部そこから利益を得て、ここまで実は特に中国の経済発展なんてそうですよね。アメリカが作り出した秩序がそれに接続してコネクトすることによって、中国はこれだけ豊かな実は経済も達成してきたわけです。でだけどもそれに対して今リゼントメントっていうか不満を持って攻撃というか敵対しようとしているということは、実はある意味非常に矛盾をしているのじゃないかと。つまり特に一つだけ中国だけを例にしてみれば、今習近平主席がリーダーシップを確立して、それでこれから実は彼自身が大きな責任を持って中国をリードしていく。しかしながらその中国人の国民の希望というのは、おそらく豊かな生活だったり経済発展だったりするわけですよね。ところがもしこれでその今まで豊かなシステムが閉じてしまったらば、それは中国が実は豊かになれないかもしれない。大いなる逆説をはらんでいて、大変面白い話は、やはり習近平主席が今年の初めにワールドエコノミックフォーラムで自由貿易が非常に大事だということを言って、これはある意味ジョークのようでいて、でも多分彼らにとっては本気の部分であって、この矛盾なんですよね、私が興味があるのは。つまり国を豊かにするためには自由な体制が必要である。しかしその自由な体制というのを実は望んでいない部分が中国やロシアという政治体制にある。この矛盾、最終的にはどう解決するのか、私は大変興味あるんですが、それはある意味我々日本やアメリカやいわゆる西側の諸国の戦略にはならないのか、どう生かせるのか、まずはここを先生にお聞きしたいなと思いました。
Well, thank you very much for your question, and I applaud your stamina in moderating 3 discussions in a row. I think the contradiction that you point to is a real tension between the desire to benefit from open access to an open economy, a global economy, while maintaining political control. And I think in both cases, regimes in Russia and China are trying to do something which in the long run may turn out to be impossible to sustain. However, many people in the West believe that it would be impossible to get this far. And indeed, the expectation or the prediction that China would move rapidly towards democracy that was made very openly in the early 1990s and was one of the most important arguments made in favor of in the United States of granting most favored nation status to China, removing the sanctions that were imposed after Tiananmen, supporting China's entry into the WTO. The strongest argument was that in a relatively short period of time, openness would promote economic growth, which would lead to the development of a middle class, which would lead inevitably, in the Western view, to the emergence of political democracy. And of course, that hasn't happened. Now, it may be that we're impatient and it will take longer for that to come about. The problem is, in the meantime, that we're now confronted, in the case of China in particular, by a country that's much richer and much stronger, but which appears, at the moment at least, to be even more repressive and to have an even stronger and more determined authoritarian regime than might have been true 25 years ago. So we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that reality. And as I said, I think both the Chinese and Russian regimes have come up with strategies that they think will allow them to continue on the path that they're following. They may be wrong, and in fact, I think they probably are wrong in the long run. But in the meantime, they pose a serious challenge to us.
ありがとうございます。 でそのチャレンジ、私も同感で大変なチャレンジだと私も思っていて、その一つにですね、これは先生もフリードバーグ先生もお聞きになったことあるきっと思いますが、ドイツ人の政治学者がデジタルレーニズム、レーニン主義、つまり今までのテクノロジーだったら、例えば中国やロシアのような、かつてのソ連のような計画経済というのは、必ずしも国を豊かにしない、一時的には豊かにするかもしれないけど、多元主義が結局は経済を豊かにするし、長期的な持続的な成長を可能にする。ところが新しい技術の出現、ちょうどフリードバーグ先生もちょうど中国のその顔を認識させてコントロールするっていう話を例に挙げてたと思うんですが、今そのビッグデータや人工知能を使うことによって巨大な管理を可能にして、しかも資本が今までだったらどちらかというと偏った資本配分で経済が止まるようなことも、実はビッグデータを使ってそういうものを乗り越えることができるのではないか。こういうその新しい考え方というか可能性があって、そうすると例えば中国とかソ連とか多元主義を容認してないような国でもむしろ経済成長を続けることができるんじゃないかと。これは壮大な実験であって、私はもう多分人類がまだわからない話ではあると思うんですが、これは私大変興味があって、フリードバーグ先生は一体こういう可能性の危険さというか、その辺にはどう見てられるのか、それともし対処法があるとすればどういう対処があるのかをぜひお聞きしたいと思います。
Yes. Well, I agree that it is possible that the development of these new technologies may not simply serve the interests of political liberalization. Again, this was an assumption that was made very easily in the late 1980s and early 1990s in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the development of the internet. Everything seemed to be going our way, and it was easy to believe that these technologies would speed that process. And as I said, what we've learned is that a sufficiently determined regime can actually maintain a degree of control over communications that wouldn't have been anticipated 25 years ago. And in fact, the disturbing thing about some of these new developments like the social credit system, the use of big data, facial recognition software, and so on, is that they may empower the state in relation to the individual in ways that will reinforce the control of the authoritarian regimes. Again, I don't know whether that's going to be successful in the long run. I tend to think that it won't. Obviously, I prefer to think that it won't. But to me, the lesson of the last 25 years is that we have to be open to possibilities that we perhaps have not considered, and in particular, unpleasant possibilities that we might have preferred not to think about. And we have to deal with the reality we face rather than continuing to hope that something will turn up to solve the problem for us. And I don't think yet we've gotten to the point of really fully acknowledging the seriousness of this challenge. And I believe in my own country still there are many people who believe that this problem will solve itself, that eventually China will have to liberalize, or that if it doesn't, it will simply accommodate to the rules of the system that we've created. I don't see that happening.
ありがとうございます。私の質問はこれが最後になります。あとはフロアから結構面白い質問が来ています。この質問を見て、ないものが私質問をしますが、一つはアメリカについて、特にトランプ政権についてですね、私もトランプ政権のずっと選挙から中の意見からあるいは政策までずっと見てきました。それで私が今一番関心を持っているのは、矛盾だらけの多分政権だとは思うんですが、特にその中国やロシアに対して、つまり、今までのアメリカの政権とトランプ政権が大きく違うところは、そのアメリカにとって一番実は強いはずのソフトパワーでもあるはずの価値、民主主義の価値とか、それから経済の自由とか、こういうものを自ら失おうとしていると。 いうように思えるんですね。特に私ら日本人にとっては TPP から離脱をするということがびっくりしました。これは私が聞いたところだと中国の人たちは喜んだと。なぜならばTPP というのはいろんな意見がありますが、少なくても戦略コミュニティの人たちはこれは中国が地域のルールを守るように考えられた一つのツールであると。つまり中国というのは例えば安全保障上外交上のルールはあまり守りたくないかもしれないけども、経済のルールは守らないと自分たちの経済が発展できないから、そういう意味で TPP というアジア太平洋地域に経済ルールを設定することによって中国にある程度共通ルールを守る癖というかハビットというか、これをつけてほしいっていうのが多分TPP の推進者の一つの狙いだったと思うんですよね。それをものの見事にトランプ大統領はTPP から離脱ということで、じゃあ中国に優しいのかというとそうでもなくて、かなり北朝鮮に対してもあるいは自由貿易のルールに関しても中国にはものすごく厳しく出ていると。この矛盾は一体何なのかというのが私の率直な疑問です。
Well, I don't know that I'm in a very good position to explain this contradiction, and I know that I'm not in a good position to predict what the Trump administration will do. But let me make a couple of comments and offer my thoughts on a number of issues. First, as we know, in the course of the political campaign and then in his early months in office, candidate and then President Trump expressed views that were out of line with what's the broadly mainstream consensus views in the United States about U.S. foreign policy. And in particular, he expressed skepticism about free trade, skepticism about our alliances, and skepticism, if not animosity, towards the idea that the United States in some way has an interest in trying to encourage the spread of democracy. The policies that the government has pursued in the last several months vary. As you mentioned, in the case of trade, the president was able to pull out of TPP. He's talking about pulling out of NAFTA or renegotiating NAFTA, talking about pulling out of the free trade agreement with South Korea. We'll have to see how those turn out. He has not talked as much about the flaws and problems of our alliances. He seems to be convinced, in fact, that our existing alliances have value. But he has had little or nothing to say on the issue of democracy. And in my view, that's a serious mistake, and in particular in relation to China, because it encourages, I believe, the Chinese effort to promote the idea that not only the American system, but Western liberal democratic systems are tired and out of ideas and not successful, and in fact have created problems that the rest of the world now has to deal with. And it also, I think, is very discouraging to people everywhere, including in China, who live under authoritarian regimes and hope one day to have the right to express themselves, have the right to form political parties, have the right to worship as they see fit, if the United States and other liberal democracies are not reminding the world and reminding authoritarian regimes of the importance of these things, and seem to have lost faith in the values on which our system and the international system that the United States and its allies built, then we've abandoned an important tool which we ought to be using much more effectively than I think we have been for the last few months. With regards to China, I think, unfortunately, that's been a trend that's been developing over time. In the early 90s, U.S. administrations were much more vocal in criticizing China for its human rights record, and that continued into the early part of the 2000s. But I think in the last decade or so, there's been a quite marked reluctance to speak up about what's happening in China. And again, I think that's a mistake. It's wrong, in my view, morally, but it's also a mistake strategically.
ありがとうございます。それでは会場からの質問をいくつかまとめて質問させてください。一つはその中国と新しい世界の秩序についての質問がいくつか来ております。ちょっと読み上げますね。現在の国際システムはかつての大国であるイギリスやアメリカを中心に作られたものであると考えます。今中国が国力を増大させつつあり、一つの可能性としては、中国がかつてイギリスやアメリカが行ったように世界秩序を作り出し、それを維持する立場になるという可能性があると思います。この点について先生は可能性はどう考えられますでしょうか。これ一つです。もう一つはですね、この先週共産党の大会がありました習近平体制、個人体制をかなり強化して中国の世界や海外での影響力覇権を拡大していくということが構想されたように思われます。その国際規範に従って、ルールベースでの既存の世界秩序を維持していくために、おそらく中国以外の国、欧州、米国、日本、そしてアジア諸国、これの連携が必要だと思うんですが、その場合誰がキープレイヤーなのか、鍵を握っているのか、これを先生のオブザベーションからお聞かせ願えればと思います。そして3つ目、これ最後にします。このセッションこの質問では中国の規範というもの、これがその世界の規範になってしまうことを、質問者の人は恐れてるんですが、その中国の規範がつまり今の規範が壊されて中国独自のものが規範になってしまうようなことを防ぐための努力みたいなものは例えばどっかで行われているのか、例えばアメリカが考えてたりするとは思うんですが、そういうことがあれば、そういう例があれば教えていただきたいと思います。この3つの質問になります。
Okay. Thank you. I think the first and third questions are really the same questions, so let me address both together. As I understand it, the questions are, will China become the dominant power in the world? And secondly, if it does, will it then construct a new global order or system? And what will that order or system look like? As to the first question, I'm skeptical that China will in fact become the preponderant power in the world, certainly not anytime soon. I think it faces enormous challenges in sustaining its growth, even if it, aside from the political reform issues, there are questions about environmental degradation, demographic challenges, and so on. So I think, in fact, the notion that China's growth it will continue on anything like the trajectory that it's followed in recent decades is probably wrong. Moreover, even if China's power continues to grow, albeit at a slower pace, the combined wealth and power of the advanced industrial democracies is still far in excess of what China can bring to bear. It's not just the United States, but it's the United States, Japan, Korea, the European countries, and so on, and India too, that would be in opposition to an attempt by China to become a hegemonic power. That said, we know historically that countries that do rise to become dominant powers generally try to reshape the international system to better reflect what they see as their interests and their values or ideology. So it seems to me unreasonable to think that China wouldn't behave in that way if it had the power to do so. And then the question is, what would that look like? We don't know. I think even Chinese academics and theorists have been a bit reluctant to speculate about this question. But to the extent they do, they talk about a system that would be more hierarchical, in which China would be dominant, in which although as the Chinese describe it, there would be less intervention or interference in the internal affairs of other countries. China would presumably support other authoritarian regimes in various parts of the world, in particular in its own neighborhood. I don't think that's a world in which I want to live. I know it's not. And I don't think it's a world in which most people who are citizens of democratic countries would like to live. I guess the last thing I would say on that is if we want a glimpse of what China would do if it had greater power on a global level, we have to watch carefully what it does on a regional level and its attempts to create a system that would benefit China at the expense of others, I think gives some indication of that. As far as the defense of a rules-based international order, I agree that the defense of those parts of that system requires the coordination and cooperation of all those who have an interest in the preservation of those rules. That said, I don't think that kind of coordination and cooperation will be automatic. And I think China in particular will try to divide and separate the countries that might oppose it in order to achieve its objectives. So I think there need to be leaders, and there probably needs to be a leader in this process. And I don't see any substitute for the United States in that regard. It's one of the reasons why I'm concerned about the way in which the current administration has been talking, because I think if we're not going to play that role, others will have great difficulty in doing it.
ありがとうございます。アメリカの役割が非常に重要だということをお答えを聞いて、まさに関係する質問が今いくつかありますので、またいくつかまとめて質問させてください。まずは一つは中国についての見方、もう一つ2つあります。これ結構重要だと思うんで、まずその中国の一帯一路戦略、これの影響に対して、どんな影響があるのかを展望していただいて、かつ日米がどういうふうにこれには対応したらいいのか、乗った方がいいのか、それとも乗らないで牽制した方がいいのか、乗って中からコントロールってする方法もありますよね。これ今日米はどちらもどういう距離を取っていいのかっていうのは非常に悩んでるところのような気がいたします。それからもう一つ、中国は今韓国に対してTHAAD高高度ミサイル防衛システムの配備に対して制裁的な行動をしたわけですよね。あるいは日本に対して尖閣を国有化した時の対抗措置としてレアメタルの日本への輸出を止めたということがありました。これもその後 WTO に提訴した問題だと思います。要するに、経済的な影響力を行使して、地政学的な目標を達成しようとする動き、これは今後も拡大していくのでしょうか。そういう場合にどう対応したらいいのでしょうかというのが質問2つあります。それでもう一つ、これは日米同盟がこれは中国だけじゃなくてロシアや中国、こういうその自由で民主的な価値を重視していない国家に対して日米同盟が今後どういう形でどういう方向性で動いていたらいいのかを解決方法とかそういうものを示唆いただければありがたいということです。でこれ同じように似てるんですが微妙に違うんですけど、アメリカ人の方から質問を受けてます。これちょっと英語でちょっと変えます。In a time of reduced awareness and threat in American governing system and foreign involvement, how do we justify and present to the American public the necessity for confronting and checking Russia and China abroad?
Thank you very much. Well, those are all excellent and some of them very difficult questions. Let me try to answer them in order. First, as regards the One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road Initiative, China is investing substantial resources and trying to encourage others to invest in the development of a very ambitious array of infrastructure programs, both across the Eurasian landmass and down to the south, across Southeast Asia into the Indian Ocean. I think there are questions about how successful this will be, about the viability of some of the projects that the Chinese are involved in, and about their real economic utility. But that said, it's clear that these programs reflect a deep ambition, a desire to change the economic and, I think, the geopolitical map of Eurasia, and we shouldn't underestimate their potential. In my view, the United States and Japan should not have illusions of being able to somehow control what the Chinese do from the inside. I think that's a mistake. And it's interesting to see how eager the Chinese government is to win the endorsement of the Japanese government and of the US government for Belt and Road. It's not because they need us to participate, but I think they want our support, at least rhetorically, so that they can then encourage others to go along with what they're trying to do and others to invest in projects that will primarily benefit them. That's not to say that we have to oppose every aspect of what the Chinese are doing. I would rather see us, as I think the government of Japan is now trying to do, promote some alternative projects that would serve similar purposes, but which would also support transparency, efficiency. Democratic governments would avoid some of the traps that China seems to have set for some of its partners with imposing high levels of debt and so on. This whole idea of improving Eurasian connectivity actually started in the West at the end of the Cold War. It was part of an attempt to unify the Eurasian continent and to build a Europe and a Eurasia whole and free. I think we've sort of dropped the ball and let the Chinese pick it up, and we should be advancing our own projects and programs, again, as I know the Japanese government currently is. Secondly, on the issue of economic statecraft, I do think that we are going to see more, I think we are seeing more of this from China. It would be surprising, I think, if we didn't. The growth of China's economy, the importance of the Chinese market, and now China's weight as an investor gives it tools with which it can try to exert political leverage. And we've seen that. The ROK example is an interesting one because it was so overt and also because China demonstrated a willingness to use these instruments against a major advanced economy. They've done similar things to the Philippines, for example, which is much smaller and weaker. But they clearly were trying to punish the South Korean government for its cooperation with the United States in taking measures that are intended to enhance their own defense. I noticed today a story indicating that the Chinese and South Korean governments have come to an agreement that suggests that China is going to back away from some of these sanctions. But the interesting thing about this assessment, I don't know if it's accurate, but was that it suggested that in the period in which these measures have been imposed, South Korea suffered a loss of 0.4% of GDP growth in 2017. That's a very substantial penalty. And in my view, what the Chinese have done is to send a message. They didn't succeed in persuading the South Korean government to back out of the THAAD arrangement, but I suspect South Koreans will have to be careful and think twice next time they're faced with a difficult decision to which the Chinese object. So I expect that we're going to see more economic statecraft, although I think it'll take forms different than the ones that we're accustomed to. The Chinese version, the Chinese object in theory to sanctions, but they impose their own sanctions, which they don't seek to justify under international law, and which in many cases they deny. So they're developing their own techniques. Regarding the U.S.-Japan alliance, what direction, how to deal with these challenges, I think the U.S.-Japan alliance is absolutely critical to any effort that's going to be made to maintain a favorable balance of power in the world, and in particular in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region. And I think we've made substantial progress in improving that cooperation. And Japan in particular has made serious efforts to enhance its defense capabilities and to enhance its ability to cooperate closely with the United States. So that's very positive. But I think we also have to expand that circle of cooperation. The United States has bilateral alliances with a number of other countries in the region. And in addition to strengthening those bilateral ties, I think we have to promote multilateral defense cooperation, strategic cooperation, as broadly as possible to include primarily other democratic countries. So the Japanese proposal recently to revive the idea of a Quad that would include the United States, Japan, India, and Australia in discussing and trying to promote regional security is, in my view, a positive one. The United States doesn't have to be involved in each of these pieces of the network, but I think we have a strong interest in encouraging it to develop because it's a natural response to the growth of Chinese power and to Chinese behavior. It's a balancing tendency which I think needs our encouragement and needs our backing, but which now has, I think, a life of its own as a result of the way the Chinese have behaved. The last question is, for me, the most difficult, and as an American, the most important question, which is how to present to the American people, the American taxpayer and voter, the importance of doing the things that I described and that I believe strongly need to be done. It's interesting, over the course of the Cold War, really since the end of the Second World War, there developed a consensus in favor of the broad policies that were pursued by both Republican and Democratic administrations, increasing free trade, maintaining our alliances, seeking to promote democracy. And that consensus was sustained even after the end of the Cold War. In my view, we're now having the debate, or we should have the debate, that we didn't have, but might have usefully had at the end of the Cold War over what our role is going to be. By not having that debate, by just continuing what we were doing, by operating on inertia, we, and I guess I mean here political leaders and elites, we're relying on the sort of passive acquiescence and support of the American people rather than going to them and trying to explain why it was important to continue to do the things that we needed to do. So I think we have to, those of us who believe in the U.S. continuing to play this role, have to do better than we've done in explaining why we think that's necessary. The good news is that if you look at public opinion polls, what they suggest is that, at least for the moment, there are continued high levels of support for all of the things I just mentioned. Well over half of people questioned in a recent poll supported alliances, supported freer trade, supported immigration, and so on. So the current administration and the rhetoric of our president doesn't appear to me to be in alignment with the underlying beliefs and wishes of the American public, which isn't to say that those couldn't change. But I think there's a lot to work with there. We just have to make the effort.
ありがとうございます。今日米豪印のアプローチというのは非常に的確じゃないかという話をしていただいたので大変嬉しいのは、私ここの笹川平和財団でもその前の組織でもこれに関するトラック 1.5 のアプローチしてまして、非常にここは私らも重要だと思って仕事をシンクタンクとしてですけど民間としてやらせてもらっております。それで質問を続けさせてください。一つはこれ英語で来てますが、これ結構読みます。I agree with Professor Friedberg completely, but I'm just curious to hear. That's a sensitive one, a little bit. It was the U.S. war against Iraq in 2003. You were in the government. a challenge to liberal international order, was it the right approach to defend it? That's one question. And how can liberal democracy cooperate with each other, like Japan and Germany on China?
I'm sorry, could you just repeat that?
How can liberal democracies cooperate with each other, like Japan over Germany, over China or Russia? And does President Trump understand the importance of maintaining a liberal order? Could he be even a threat to that liberal democratic order? And let me continue another question in English. How do you explain to the authoritarian challenge in you explain in regard to North Korean threat? That's the first one, North Korean issues. And the another North Korean issue, very related. Any chance for North Korea to be the part of the liberal international order you discussed today? If yes, it should be, I think, a good way the current tension.
Well, is there any chance for the DPRK to be part of the liberal democratic order? I think the answer in theory is yes, if it becomes a liberal democracy, which unfortunately is a remote possibility at this point. But this system is open, I think, to countries, or should be open to countries which adopt certain kinds of domestic institutions. I'm not sure I understood the question about the challenge, the relationship of the authoritarian challenge to the North Korea problem, but let me say a few words about that. I think that one of the things that's striking to me about the North Korean problem is that China really has played a critical role in shielding North Korea from all the international pressure that could conceivably have been brought to bear on it. And I think this has been true for some time, going back to the Bush administration, the attempt to impose economic sanctions. China has appeared to cooperate, but at the same time, it's undermined the effectiveness of those sanctions by trading with China, by giving aid to China, or rather North Korea. So why is that so? It's at least in part, I think, for all the reasons that people suggest, the fear on the part of the Chinese of the consequences of a North Korean collapse, the concern that they have about the possibility of a unified Korea, which would be under the control of a democratic government. But I think also the Chinese authorities have, over the years, skillfully exploited the hope in the United States and elsewhere that if we weren't too tough on them on other issues, they would help us deal with the North Korean issue. If we've learned anything over the last 15 years, I would hope we've learned that that isn't very likely to happen. Does President Trump understand the importance of liberal democratic order? I don't know. I've never spoken to him. He says things that suggest that he does not, or at least that he doesn't value it, and that he puts other things higher than that. His view is that there should be an American interest that in some way is separate from support for a larger international order or system. And that's a way of thinking about foreign policy which has a long tradition in the United States and elsewhere. It's not illegitimate. I do think it's incorrect. How can liberal democracies cooperate with each other over China? That is, on the one hand, we are cooperating, certainly in some areas, in strategic matters, the United States and Japan, the United States and Australia as well. I think there needs to be more cooperation. And the cooperation that I believe is particularly important is going to be in dealing with some of the economic challenges that China presents. If we don't like some of the policies that China pursues, for example, in its attitudes towards intellectual property, or its use of subsidies to support its own industries, or its use of non-tariff barriers to restrict the access to its markets of foreign companies, we have to cooperate with one another to apply pressure to try to get China to change those policies. So I think there's a need for cooperation beyond the kind of narrow military and strategic domain. And I think there's also room and a need for cooperation on these issues of values. When the United States lectures the Chinese authorities about human rights, it's easy to dismiss as the criticism of a hostile foreign power that wants to weaken China. But if it's a dozen countries or 20 countries together calling China to account for its treatment of dissidents, for the fact that it imprisoned a political dissident and allowed him to die, despite the fact that he was a winner of the Nobel Prize and the things that he had said were not really fundamental challenges to political stability in China, but just didn't appeal to the Chinese Communist Party. I think it's important to do that in a collective way. I'm not going to relitigate the question of the Iraq War, as interesting as that might be. On the question of whether it was a challenge to the liberal democratic order, I think one thing I would say is that the United States, in a way, got the worst of all possible worlds in the ways that it proceeded to go to war with Iraq in attempting to get the support of the United Nations Security Council, so seeming to place importance on that, which the United States hasn't always done, and then proceeding to go to war, having failed to do that. I think it would have been wiser either not to have done that, not to have gone to war, or not to have attempted to get that, that kind of support. One last comment, whatever else we can say about it, it's clear that the events that followed 9/11, including the war in Afghanistan, which is still going on, and the war in Iraq, deflected American attention and resources to an extraordinary degree, and I think slowed our ability to respond to the challenge that I've been discussing. So whatever else one can say about those events and the decisions that were made to engage in those conflicts, in the long term, I think they will have served to weaken our position and to make more difficult the response that I think we now have to undertake.
ありがとうございます。もう時間が迫ってますが、一つだけちょっとユニークというか、私も興味ある質問があるので、質問短く済むと思います。オーソリタリアンチャレンジということで、ロシアと中国扱ってますけど、他のオーソリタリアンレジーム、例えばサウジアラビアとか、あるいはトルコが最近非常に独裁化が強まっていると思うんですが、そういう国というのは実際にはこのリベラルインターナショナルオーダーに対しての脅威とはなっているのでしょうかという質問で、これ割とユニークな視点なので私も興味あります。これ最後の質問です。
Well, thank you. I think the countries mentioned, and of course there are other Central Asian republics, many of them, Iran is another, not democratic. They're not all equal in their power, and therefore they're not all equal in the extent to which they pose a challenge. However, one of the things that's interesting and troubling in recent years is the extent to which all of these countries are pursuing similar tactics and also seem to be cooperating and exchanging information and learning from one another techniques of population control, control over the internet, and so on. And this is a troubling reversal of the trend that many people thought was carrying the world towards full liberalization 25 years ago. I think we've learned to be, or we should have learned to be humble in our expectations and realistic in our anticipation that the world is going to achieve perpetual peace anytime soon.
ありがとうございます。 私前に座らせてもらって教授の前でこうやって質問をして、しかもそれを全部観客が聞いてると、こんな一生懸命勉強することはないですよね。うちの息子にもぜひここに座らせて勉強させたいなと思いました。フリードバーグ先生、どうもありがとうございました。